For 5 long years, my parents acted like I was completely dead. They erased me from their lives entirely until their lawyer mailed me the exact document they thought would ruin me forever. He called my office and told me they just needed my signature to keep my late grandmother's house. I laughed so hard he actually stopped speaking, because the one specific clause they completely forgot to read was the exact same one my grandmother wrote to protect me. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one. My name is Abigail Hayes. I am 31 years old, and I work as a tax accountant at a highly respected financial firm in the quiet suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that people will lie to your face, but the math will always tell you the truth. I have spent my entire adult life catching the tiny financial discrepancies that other people think no one will ever notice. That exact professional skill is what saved my life last Tuesday. It was a perfectly normal Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a complex corporate tax return and sipping my coffee when the mailroom clerk dropped a massive overnight package right in front of me. It was heavy and thick. The return address printed in bold, arrogant letters read, "The Law Offices of Robert Sterling." I did not know anyone named Robert Sterling. I broke the cardboard seal and pulled out a stack of legal documents that had to be at least 80 pages long. Right on top of the crisp white title page was a bright yellow sticky note. The handwriting on it was sharp and aggressive. The note read, "Your family needs to finalize your grandmother's estate. Sign page 14 and overnight it back today. We have included a prepaid envelope. Do not delay." I stared at that bright yellow square of paper for a long time. The words "your family" felt like a physical blow to my chest. I had not spoken a single word to my parents, Thomas and Susan Hayes, in 5 long years. 5 years ago, they stood in front of our entire extended family and gave me an impossible ultimatum. During the lavish country club rehearsal dinner for my sister Chloe's wedding, my parents cornered me in the hallway. Chloe and her husband Trent had gone $30,000 over their already massive wedding budget. Chloe was the undisputed golden child of the family, and Trent was a flashy guy who ran a failing tech startup but loved to project wealth. My parents demanded that I drain my entire life savings to bail them out. They wanted the money I had, painstakingly saved for my own house down payment, to pay for Chloe's imported floral arrangements and upgraded champagne. When I looked my mother in the eye and firmly said no, Susan Hayes lost her mind. She marched right back into the banquet room and declared in front of all our relatives that I was a selfish monster. She stated clearly and loudly that if I would not sacrifice my future for my sister, I was no longer a part of the Hayes family. They blocked my phone number that very night. They deleted me from the family group chats. I was completely banned from Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings. They treated me like I was dead. I accepted my exile silently and spent those 5 years building a peaceful and successful life on my own. Now suddenly a high-priced lawyer from a fancy downtown firm was sending me demands on a sticky note. I picked up the thick stack of papers. The sheer volume of the document was clearly designed to be intimidating. Most ordinary people would feel totally overwhelmed by 80 pages of dense legal jargon. They might just flip directly to page 14 and sign exactly where the bright yellow arrow pointed just to make the anxiety go away. They might trust the professional-sounding letterhead and the urgent, demanding tone. But I am a tax accountant. I look at complex legal documents for a living. I know better than to blindly trust an aggressive deadline from a man I have never met. Before I could even turn past the title page, my desk phone rang loudly. It was an outside caller ID. I picked up the receiver and gave my standard polite professional greeting. The voice on the other end was smooth, polished, and laced with deep impatience. He introduced himself as attorney Robert Sterling, representing Thomas and Susan Hayes. He asked immediately if I had received his overnight package. I told him it had just landed on my desk 2 minutes ago. "Excellent," he said. His voice dripped with that particular kind of condescension that wealthy men use when speaking to young women they consider unimportant. "I need you to sign the waiver on page 14 right now and drop it in the courier box before the final pickup today. Your parents are very eager to wrap this entire process up." I sat back in my desk chair. A waiver. He had just deliberately called it a waiver. In the financial world, waivers are entirely about giving up your legal rights. I asked him flatly what exactly I was waiving. Robert Sterling sighed loudly into the receiver. I could picture him rolling his eyes and checking his expensive watch. Abigail, your parents are going through a very difficult time right now, grieving your grandmother. They just want to keep her beautiful house for sentimental reasons. The title company requires all potential family heirs to sign off, so we can clear the title completely and put the property properly in your parents' names. It is just a standard formality. Do not make this difficult for your grieving family. Do not make this difficult. That exact phrase echoed violently in my head. That was the precise phrase my mother Susan used 5 years ago when she demanded my $30,000. The sheer entitlement of these people was absolutely sickening. Mr. Sterling, I said. My voice was completely steady and cold. I am a licensed tax accountant. I spend 50 hours every single week analyzing complex financial structures and legal contracts. I do not sign 80-page legal documents because a complete stranger on the phone tells me it is a standard formality. I need to read this entire package in full. His tone shifted instantly from patronizing to highly aggressive. Listen to me, young lady. Your family has been through enough pain already. They are simply trying to preserve a cherished family heirloom. If you drag this out, you will cause unnecessary legal fees and severe emotional distress for your poor mother. Just sign the page and overnight it back. It will take you 2 seconds. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline. Whenever someone pressures you to act quickly without thinking, it means they are terrified of what you will find if you take your time to look. I gripped the phone receiver tightly. I told him I would not be signing anything today. I told him I would review the documents on my own schedule and contact him when I had finished my professional review. You are making a huge mistake, Abigail, he snapped. Your father warned me you would be difficult and stubborn. Do not play games with us. I hung up the phone without saying another word. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. I was shaking with absolute outrage. My father had warned him I would be stubborn. My father, who had not called me on my birthday in 5 long years, was busy painting me as the villain to his expensive lawyer. I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart. Then I stood up, reached over, and locked my office door. I walked back to my desk and cleared everything else away. I moved my active client files, my calculator, and my coffee mug to the side table. I placed the 80-page document right in the absolute center of my desk. I pulled out a yellow highlighter and a red pen. I was no longer Abigail, the discarded scapegoat daughter. I was Abigail, the professional auditor. I started on page 1 and committed to reading every single word. It took me less than 10 minutes to realize that Robert Sterling had completely lied to me on the phone. This was not a standard title clearing document. This was not a simple waiver for potential heirs to step aside. The actual title of the document, buried under pages of confusing legal preambles, was a petition for the dissolution of an irrevocable trust. My grandmother had not left a simple will. She had set up an irrevocable trust. In my profession, I deal with trusts all the time. An irrevocable trust is a financial fortress. Once it is legally created, the person who made it cannot simply change their mind. The assets inside the trust are locked down tight, completely protected from creditors, from lawsuits, and from greedy relatives looking for a quick payout. To break an irrevocable trust after the creator has passed away, you need a massive legal petition, and you absolutely need the sworn notarized consent of every single beneficiary named in the document. I flipped through the dense pages reading the property descriptions. The trust held my grandmother's sprawling house in the very best neighborhood in Columbus. It was a beautiful historical property, easily worth $800,000 in today's market. And my parents were desperately, urgently, frantically trying to dissolve the exact trust that protected it. I stopped reading and stared at the blank wall of my office. The immediate question hit me like a physical blow. Why? Why go through the incredible expense of hiring a high-priced attorney to break an ironclad trust? If my grandmother wanted them to own the house outright, she would have just given it to them in a simple basic will. Instead, she deliberately put it in an irrevocable trust. She intentionally locked it away from them. She knew exactly what she was doing. My grandmother was the only person who saw my parents for who they really were. She knew they cared more about maintaining their wealthy facade at the country club than they cared about financial stability. She knew Trent was a walking disaster, and Chloe would spend every dime she was given. She knew I was the only responsible one in the family. I looked back down at the heavy stack of paper. Why did they need my signature at all? If I had been completely written out of the family, if they truly believed I was dead to them, they would not need my permission to do anything. You do not need the signature of a disowned child to dissolve a trust, unless that specific child holds the keys to the entire castle. My parents, Thomas and Susan Hayes, who practically worshipped their suburban social status, were trying to quietly dismantle the ultimate legal protection my grandmother had carefully built. And they needed the daughter they threw away like garbage to help them do it. They thought they could bully me. They thought I was still the obedient, compliant little girl who would bow her head to keep the peace. They thought I would blindly sign page 14 out of guilt or intimidation. They were so incredibly wrong. I grabbed my red pen and turned to the section outlining the trust beneficiaries. I needed to know exactly what my grandmother had written. I needed to know exactly why my parents were so terrified of a 31-year-old accountant sitting alone in her office. The truth was hiding somewhere in these 80 pages, and I was going to find every single piece of it. I traced my finger down the heavy textured paper of the trust dissolution petition. Right there on page 3, under a list of interested parties, a specific name jumped out at me in bold black ink. Chloe Elizabeth Hayes. Seeing my younger sister's name printed so formally did not make me feel any familial warmth. Instead, it triggered a deeply familiar ache in my chest, a ledger of systemic injustice that had governed my entire life. Growing up in our pristine suburban Columbus neighborhood, love was never a free gift. It was a highly restricted currency, and my parents, Thomas and Susan, only ever spent it on Chloe. Chloe was the undisputed golden child. She was the visionary, the delicate soul who needed constant protection and financial subsidies. I was the reliable workhorse, the spare tire. Whenever I achieved something, it was met with a distracted nod. Whenever Chloe did the bare minimum, it was celebrated with expensive dinners at the country club. The financial disparities were staggering. When I turned 18, I was handed a stack of student loan applications and told that building character meant paying my own way through state college. I worked 30 hours a week waiting tables and doing basic bookkeeping for local shops just to afford my textbooks and rent. Meanwhile, Chloe went to an expensive private out-of-state university. My parents completely funded her tuition, her sorority fees, her spring break trips to Cabo, and bailed out her credit cards every single semester. Whenever I dared to ask why things were so entirely unbalanced, my mother would look at me with profound disappointment. She would say that Chloe was sensitive and needed a safety net. She would say that I was so independent and practical that I did not need their help. I learned very quickly that in the Hayes household, my independence was not a virtue to be celebrated. It was simply an excuse for my parents to abandon their responsibilities toward me so they could shower everything on their favorite child. I was expected to succeed quietly and demand absolutely nothing. My sacrifices were never acknowledged as favors. They were treated as mandatory family duties. I remember the year I finally landed my first real job as a junior tax accountant. I was so proud. I had saved up for months to buy a reliable used Honda Civic so I could commute to the office. I drove it to my parents' house hoping for a single word of congratulations. Instead, my father, Thomas, took one look at the dented bumper and told me to park it down the street so the neighbors would not see it. An hour later, Chloe arrived in a brand new pristine white luxury SUV. It was a graduation gift from our parents. They paid the massive down payment and co-signed the expensive lease. When I asked how they could afford that, when they claimed they had no money to help with my student loans, my mother Susan simply sighed and adjusted her pearl necklace. Chloe needs to project a successful image for her new career, Abigail, she told me. You sit in a cubicle all day looking at spreadsheets. Nobody cares what you drive. That was the reality of my existence. I was the invisible foundation they stood on while they paraded Chloe around like a trophy. And as I sat at my desk, staring at the legal petition trying to strip away my grandmother's trust, I realized they still saw me exactly the same way. A convenient tool to be used and discarded. I kept reading down the page of the legal petition and saw another name that made my jaw clench tight. Trent Harrison, my brother-in-law, the man who finalized my exile from the family. Seeing his name brought the memories of 5 years ago rushing back with violent clarity. It was a humid Friday evening in June. We were at the most exclusive country club in the suburbs for Chloe's wedding rehearsal dinner. Trent was exactly the kind of man my parents adored. He was loud, flashy, and constantly bragging about his new tech startup. He drove expensive cars and wore custom suits, but anyone who actually looked at the math could tell he was drowning in debt. Trent and Chloe were a match made in financial heaven. They both loved to spend money they simply did not have. Their wedding was a massive spectacle designed specifically to impress my parents, wealthy friends from church. But a month before the wedding, the bills started crashing down. Chloe had insisted on imported orchids from Holland, a custom designer gown and cases of vintage champagne that were completely out of their budget. They were $30,000 in the hole, and the vendors were threatening to walk away right before the ceremony. That is when my parents decided I was the solution to their self-created disaster. During the rehearsal dinner, my mother and father pulled me out of the banquet hall and cornered me in a quiet, empty corridor near the cloakroom. My father stood blocking the hallway, while my mother grabbed my arm with a desperate, frantic grip. "Abigail," she said, her voice urgent and breathless, "your sister is in trouble. The wedding planner needs a $30,000 final payment tomorrow morning, or they are canceling the reception. We need you to write a check." I stared at them in absolute disbelief. I had been working 80-hour weeks during tax season for 4 straight years. I had lived in a tiny, rundown apartment, eating cheap pasta and skipping vacations so I could save up a down payment for my first house. I had exactly $32,000 sitting in my savings account. It was my entire future, and they wanted me to drain it instantly to pay for Chloe's imported flowers and expensive booze. I told them I did not have $30,000 to spare. My father scowled and crossed his arms. "Do not lie to us, Abigail," he snapped. "We know you have been saving for a house. You can delay buying a house for a few more years. You are single anyway. Chloe is starting her new family. She needs this to be perfect. You have to save your sister's special day." I felt a cold knot of absolute clarity form in my stomach. They were perfectly willing to burn down my entire future just to keep Chloe's wealthy facade intact. They felt completely entitled to the money I had sacrificed years of my life to save. I looked at my mother and father, and for the first time in my entire life, I set a hard, permanent boundary. I looked them straight in the eye and firmly, clearly said no. The moment that single word left my lips, the atmosphere in the hallway turned to pure ice. My mother, Susan, let go of my arm as if I had burned her. Her face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. She did not just accept my answer and walk away. She decided to punish me in the most public and humiliating way possible. She turned around and marched directly back into the grand banquet room, where 40 of our extended family members were eating steak and drinking wine. She marched right up to the head table, clinking her glass with a spoon until the entire room fell dead silent. Then my mother stood tall and pointed a perfectly manicured finger straight at me as I stood frozen in the doorway. "Everyone look at my eldest daughter!" she announced, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "We just asked her for a simple favor to help her sister in a moment of need, and she refused. She is hoarding her money while her own sister suffers. If you will not sacrifice for your sister Abigail, you are no longer a part of this family." I stood there while 40 pairs of eyes stared at me in total silence. Not a single aunt or uncle spoke up in my defense. My father simply looked away. Chloe sat at the table crying performative tears into a linen napkin, while Trent rubbed her shoulders. I did not yell or cause a scene. I simply turned around, walked out the front doors of the country club, and drove myself home in my old dented car. That was the exact moment I was completely erased from the Hayes family. By the time I woke up the next morning, I had been permanently removed from every family group chat. I was blocked on every social media platform. My parents blocked my phone number. When Thanksgiving rolled around a few months later, I received absolutely no invitation. I spent Christmas morning completely alone in my apartment, eating takeout and watching snow fall outside my window. They treated me as if I had died. At first, the pain of being discarded so easily was almost unbearable. I had spent my entire life trying to be good enough, smart enough, and quiet enough to finally earn their love. But as the months turned into years, the profound grief slowly transformed into total peace. I realized that by throwing me away, they had actually set me free. I no longer had to walk on eggshells. I no longer had to clean up Chloe's messes or seek validation from parents who were utterly incapable of giving it. I focused entirely on my career. I bought my beautiful house. I built a chosen family of close friends and colleagues who valued me for exactly who I was. For 5 years, I lived a successful, quiet, and peaceful life, entirely free of the toxic Hayes family drama. I had made my peace with the silence. But now, as I sat at my desk, staring at the legal petition demanding my signature by the end of the day, the 5 years of silence were officially over. They had thrown me away like garbage when I refused to give them my money. Now they suddenly needed me to sign away my grandmother's estate. I picked up my red pen, took a deep breath, and began to read the fine print. I sat back in my leather office chair and stared at the massive stack of paper on my desk. The bright yellow sticky note from attorney Robert Sterling mocked me with its demanding, arrogant tone. "Sign page 14, it commanded. But I was not the naive, obedient 13-year-old girl they had thrown out into the dark. I was a 31-year-old tax accountant. My entire career was built on finding the hidden truths buried inside thick, confusing financial documents. I picked up my red pen, took a deep, steadying breath, and turned to page 1. The first thing I noticed was the title of the document itself. It was officially labeled a Petition for the Dissolution and Winding Up of the Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Living Trust. My grandmother Evelyn had passed away 4 years ago. At the time, my parents had proudly announced to everyone at their country club that they had inherited her beautiful historic estate in the most expensive neighborhood in Columbus. They threw a massive party to celebrate. They posted pictures posing on the wraparound porch, acting like the ultimate suburban royalty. I had assumed, like everyone else, that my grandmother simply left them the house in a standard will. I was wrong. My grandmother was far smarter than anyone in our family ever realized. As I read through the dense legal jargon of the original trust formation documents, a profound sense of awe washed over me. An irrevocable trust is not just a piece of paper. It is a financial vault. When you put an asset into an irrevocable trust, you are permanently removing it from your own personal estate. You cannot change your mind later. You cannot just casually rewrite it. And most importantly, creditors cannot touch it. But people rarely set up an irrevocable trust unless they are trying to protect a massive asset from massive incompetence. I traced my red pen. Under the specific clauses my grandmother had carefully constructed over a decade ago, reading her legal stipulations was like hearing her voice speaking directly to me from beyond the grave. My grandmother spent her entire life working hard and saving diligently. She was a quiet, observant woman who rarely criticized anyone out loud. But she saw everything. She saw my father Thomas constantly trying to keep up with his wealthy golf buddies. She saw my mother Susan spending thousands of dollars on designer clothes and lavish parties just to maintain a flawless image at their suburban church. She saw them endlessly funding my sister Chloe's extravagant lifestyle and pouring money into my brother-in-law's ridiculous failing tech startups. My grandmother knew that if she left her $800,000 historic home directly to Thomas and Susan, they would treat it like a giant atmospheric ATM. They would take out a massive second mortgage to pay off Chloe's credit card debt. They would leverage the equity to fund Trent's terrible business ideas. They would eventually lose the family home to foreclosure, just to keep up appearances. So she did not leave them the house. She locked it away inside the absolute strongest legal fortress she could afford. I turned to page 6, where the core provisions of the trust were laid out in bold black ink. I read the paragraph twice just to make absolutely sure my trained eyes were not deceiving me. The trust explicitly stated that Thomas and Susan Hayes were not the owners of the property. They were strictly designated as life tenants. They had been granted a life estate. I let out a slow breath as the absolute brilliance of my grandmother's plan fully registered in my mind. A life estate is a very specific real estate mechanism. It meant my parents had the legal right to live in the house for the rest of their natural lives. They could sleep in the master bedroom. They could plant hydrangeas in the front yard. They could host their fancy catered dinners and let all their snobby friends assume they owned the place. But it was all an illusion. They did not own a single brick, because they were only life tenants. My parents were legally trapped by ironclad restrictions. They were required to pay the property taxes. They were legally obligated to pay for all the upkeep and maintenance. but they had absolutely no power over the asset itself. They could not sell the house. They could not borrow against the house. They could not use it as collateral for a business loan. They were essentially glorified renters who were forced to pay for the privilege of maintaining someone else's property. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. For the past 4 years, my parents had been living in a beautiful, wealthy neighborhood, projecting an image of absolute financial superiority. But beneath the surface, they were completely powerless. They were living inside a gilded cage perfectly designed by a woman who knew their greed would eventually destroy them. I looked back at the aggressive sticky note from their lawyer, urging me to sign page 14 immediately. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly clicking together in my analytical mind. You do not hire an expensive downtown attorney to dissolve an irrevocable trust unless you are absolutely desperate to get your hands on the underlying asset. A life estate produces no cash. It produces no equity. If my parents were trying to shatter the trust, it meant they were out of money. It meant the country club facade was finally cracking, and they desperately needed to sell my grandmother's house to save themselves. But there was a massive legal roadblock standing in their way. A life estate is only half of the equation. If my parents only had the right to live there until they died, someone else had to own the actual legal rights to the property itself. Someone else held the ultimate authority over what happened to that $800,000 house. And to dissolve an irrevocable trust and sell the property, you absolutely need the sworn notarized signature of that specific person. I gripped my red pen. My heart began to pound a heavy rhythmic beat against my ribs as I flipped the thick pages forward. I needed to know exactly who my grandmother had trusted to protect her legacy. I needed to know exactly whose signature my arrogant parents were suddenly so desperate to obtain. I turned to page 8 to find the legal designation of the final owner. I turned the heavy parchment page to section 4. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of legal text, searching for the specific clause that dictated the final disposition of the trust assets. In the legal and financial world, we call this person the remainder man. The remainder man is the ultimate beneficiary. They are the person who inherits the absolute total control and ownership of the property, the very second the life tenants pass away or violate the strict terms of the trust agreement. I ran my red pen down the margin of the page until I found the bolded heading, Designation of Remainder Man. I braced my shoulders and took a tight breath. I fully expected to see Chloe's name printed there. I expected to see that my grandmother had somehow been manipulated by my smooth-talking parents into leaving the ultimate prize to their beloved golden child. But that is not what the document said at all. I stopped breathing for a full 10 seconds. I read the long, complex sentence again, and then I read it a third time to make absolutely sure I was not hallucinating. The ink on the page seemed to blur as hot tears suddenly welled up in my eyes. The legal clause stated clearly and unequivocally that upon the termination of the life estate, the entirety of the trust property and all its associated financial assets shall pass directly and exclusively to my eldest granddaughter, Abigail Marie Hayes. Me. I was the remainder man. I was the sole legal owner of an $800,000 historic estate in the absolute most prestigious neighborhood in Columbus. I sat back in my leather office chair and covered my mouth with my trembling hands. A massive wave of profound, overwhelming emotion washed over me. For my entire life, my parents, Thomas and Susan, had made me feel completely invisible. They had treated me like a useless burden, like a secondary background character, in the grand theatrical production of Chloe's perfect suburban life. But my grandmother Evelyn had actually seen me. She had seen my late nights studying, my hard work, my quiet sacrifices, and my fierce independence. She did not view my self-reliance as a convenient excuse to abandon me the way my parents did. She viewed it as a sign of absolute strength and character. She trusted me completely. She knew I was the only person in the entire family responsible enough to handle a legacy of that magnitude. She had deliberately bypassed her own greedy son and his favorite spoiled daughter to leave everything she had built directly to me. But the beautiful warmth of my grandmother's protective love was instantly shattered by the cold, horrifying reality of what my parents were trying to do to me right in this very moment. The analytical tax accountant side of my brain kicked into high gear, pushing the tears aside. I grabbed the bright yellow sticky note that attorney Robert Sterling had attached to the front of the packet. Sign page 14 and overnight it back today. I grabbed the thick stack of papers and flipped directly to page 14. It was a formal legal waiver and consent form. It was written in incredibly dense, confusing language intentionally designed to overwhelm and intimidate a normal everyday person. But I was not a normal everyday person. I read and dismantled binding financial contracts for a living. The waiver explicitly stated that the undersigned remainder man voluntarily agreed to dissolve the Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Living Trust in its entirety. It stated that I willfully surrendered all current and future claims to the property. If I signed my name on that single dotted line, the legal fortress my grandmother built to protect me would instantly collapse into dust. The life estate would be automatically terminated, and the full legal title of the $800,000 property would immediately default entirely back to my parents, Thomas and Susan Hayes. My stomach twisted with absolute disgust. Robert Sterling had called my office and lied directly to my face over the phone. He told me it was just a standard formality to clear the title so my grieving parents could keep the house for sentimental reasons. That was a complete and utter fabrication. If they just wanted to live in the house, they did not need to do anything at all. Their life estate already guaranteed. They could live there for the rest of their natural lives without any interference from me. They did not need to dissolve the trust to keep the house. They needed to dissolve the trust so they could sell the house. The sheer, unmatched audacity of their plan was absolutely staggering. 5 years ago, my mother stood in front of 40 family members and violently threw me out of the family because I refused to give her $30,000 for Chloe's wedding flowers. She treated me like garbage. She completely erased me from her life. And now 5 years later, she had the incredible nerve to hire an expensive downtown lawyer to trick me into signing away an $800,000 inheritance. They wanted to steal my grandmother's legacy right out from under me, and they wanted to use my own forced signature to do it. I thought about Chloe and her arrogant husband Trent. I thought about Trent's failing tech startup, his expensive custom suits, and their lavish vacations. I thought about my parents' desperate, pathetic obsession with maintaining their flawless, wealthy image at the local country club. If they were willing to commit this level of legal deception against their own daughter, it meant they were absolutely desperate for liquid cash. An $800,000 house sale would generate a massive amount of capital. It would be more than enough to completely bail Trent out of whatever massive financial disaster he had currently created. It would be more than enough to fund Chloe's luxury lifestyle for another decade. They were perfectly willing to rob their estranged daughter blind just to keep their golden child living in the lap of luxury. A cold, calculated fury began to build deep inside my chest. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was weak. They thought the intimidated, obedient girl they used to bully was going to just blindly sign a confusing legal document out of fear and deeply ingrained family guilt. They thought they could use a fancy lawyer in a high-rise building to intimidate me into handing over my entire future. I stared at the signature line on page 14. The empty space mocked me, but I was not going to sign it. I was never going to sign it. Instead, I was going to use every single professional skill I possessed to destroy their little scheme. If my parents were trying to liquidate a major real estate asset, this frantically there had to be a massive financial fire burning behind the scenes. People do not try to break an irrevocable trust unless they are running out of time and running out of options. As a tax accountant, I knew exactly how to find out why. I pushed the legal documents aside and turned to my computer to begin following the money. I sat in the quiet hum of my office with the heavy legal petition pushed to the side of my desk. The initial wave of shock had completely faded, leaving behind a cold, absolute focus. In my profession as a tax accountant, emotion is useless, but curiosity is everything. I have spent my career tracking down missing assets, uncovering hidden liabilities, and exposing financial lies that people try desperately to bury. I knew with absolute certainty that people do not hire expensive downtown attorneys to dissolve an irrevocable trust unless there is a massive financial fire burning right behind them. My parents were frantic to get their hands on an $800,000 asset that did not belong to them. I intended to find out exactly why. I turned my desk monitor toward me and opened my internet browser. When you know where to look, public records tell a story that people spend their entire lives trying to hide. I logged directly into the Franklin County Auditor's database. I bypassed the standard property searches and went straight for the deep civil dockets. I started with the most obvious source of financial bleeding in our family: my sister Chloe and her flashy husband Trent. For the past 5 years, my mother Susan had made sure everyone in her suburban social circle knew exactly how well Chloe was doing. Through the grapevine, I had heard endless stories about their lavish vacations, their custom-built home in the expensive northern suburbs, and Trent's booming tech startup. They projected an image of effortless, endless wealth. I typed their names into the search bar and hit enter. The database took a moment to load, and then the true story of the golden child populated across my screen. The very first document that caught my eye was a massive red flag. It was a notice of default filed just 3 weeks ago by a major national bank. I opened the scanned PDF and read the specific financial details. Chloe and Trent had not paid their primary mortgage in 9 months. The bank was officially initiating pre-foreclosure proceedings on their custom-built dream home. But the financial bleeding did not stop there. I scrolled further down the list of public filings and found a staggering trail of secondary debt. They had completely maxed out a home equity line of credit just last year. They had drained every single drop of equity out of that house to fund their designer lifestyle, and now the bank was coming to take it all away. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I opened a new tab. I needed to look into Trent's supposed tech empire. I navigated to the Ohio Secretary of State Business Search Portal and pulled up the corporate filings for his company. My parents always spoke about Trent as if he was the next great visionary of our generation. The public documents painted a completely pathetic picture. The startup was nothing more than a hollow shell company. I pulled the Uniform Commercial Code filings, which show exactly who holds a legal claim against a business. Trent's company had over a dozen active liens filed against it by predatory high-interest corporate lenders. Then I found the ultimate death sentence for any business. There were 2 massive tax liens filed by the state of Ohio, and a federal tax lien filed directly by the Internal Revenue Service for unpaid payroll taxes. Trent was not a successful entrepreneur. He was a complete fraud running a massive financial scam just to keep up appearances. His company was generating absolutely zero revenue, while he suffocated under hundreds of thousands of dollars in toxic business debt. The golden child and her perfect husband were mere days away from total devastating bankruptcy. The puzzle pieces were snapping together with terrifying clarity, but I needed to find the final link. Why were my parents, Thomas and Susan, trying to steal my grandmother's house to fix this? I went back to the county auditor database and typed in my parents' names. I pulled up the deed and mortgage history for the house I grew up in. The results made my stomach turn with absolute disgust. Over the last 5 years, my parents had refinanced their own home 3 separate times. They had completely drained their own equity. They had absolutely no liquid cash left to bail Chloe out of this disaster. My mother and father had bankrupted their own future just to keep funding Chloe's fake luxury lifestyle. And now that the banks were finally closing in on Trent and Chloe, my parents were completely out of options. They could not hand over another blank check because their own accounts were totally empty. I sat back and stared at the glowing computer screen. The sheer magnitude of their deception and entitlement was breathtaking. If Chloe and Trent lost their house to foreclosure, it would be a very public and humiliating scandal. Every single person at my parents' wealthy country club and their judgmental suburban church would instantly know that the perfect family was actually completely broke. My mother Susan would rather die than face that kind of social humiliation. She was absolutely desperate to protect her flawless image and her favorite daughter. The only unencumbered asset left in the entire family was my grandmother's historic $800,000 house. But that house was locked tightly inside an irrevocable trust, and I was the sole legal remainder man. They needed that house to save Chloe from public ruin. They needed to force a rapid sale and inject hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash directly into Trent's failing business before the bank seized everything they owned. They thought they could just send me a thick legal packet and a patronizing sticky note. They assumed the daughter they had discarded and treated like garbage for 5 years would just blindly sign away her entire multi-million-dollar future out of lingering childhood guilt. They expected me to remain the quiet, obedient scapegoat who always sacrificed herself to keep Chloe comfortable. They had no idea that I could see every single lie they had built. I turned off my computer screen and looked down at the petition. I was not just going to refuse to sign it. I was going to let their entire fake world burn to the ground. I turned my attention back to the massive 80-page stack of paper sitting on my desk. My heart was still pounding from uncovering the truth about my parents' financial ruin, but my professional instincts were fully awake. A standard petition to dissolve a trust does not need to be 80 pages long. Legal petitions are usually brief and to the point. The sheer volume of this packet meant that attorney Robert Sterling had included a massive amount of supporting documentation. People who are arrogant and rushed make very careless mistakes. Sterling assumed I was just a naive, estranged daughter who would immediately flip to the signature page. He completely forgot that he was mailing financial documents to a licensed tax accountant. I bypassed the legal jargon in the middle of the packet and went straight to the exhibits attached at the very back. My eyes locked onto the familiar layout of government tax forms. Sterling had included the last 5 years of the trust tax returns. Specifically, he had attached the Form 1041 documents, which are the official tax returns for estates and trust. To the average person, these pages look like a meaningless blur of boxes and numbers. To me, they were a perfectly clear roadmap of exactly what my father had been doing in the dark. My grandmother was a brilliantly practical woman. She knew that leaving an expensive historic home in a trust meant someone had to pay the annual property taxes and the expensive maintenance costs. If my parents were broke, they would never be able to afford the upkeep, and the house would fall into disrepair. So my grandmother had not just left a house. I looked at the asset schedules and saw that she had also left a substantial principal investment account attached to the trust. That account was specifically designed to generate dividend income every year. My father Thomas had been named the financial trustee of that account. He had a strict legal fiduciary duty to use those dividends exclusively for the maintenance and taxes of the property. I pulled out my calculator and my red pen. I started at the tax return from 5 years ago, the exact same year my parents threw me out of the family. I looked at the line tracking the annual distributions. A cold, deep shock radiated through my chest. According to the official tax documents, my father had distributed exactly $30,000 from the trust account that year. I moved to the next year. Another $30,000 distributed. I flipped the page to the 3rd year. Another $30,000. I checked the 4th and 5th years. The pattern was perfectly identical. Every single year for the past 5 years, my father had authorized a $30,000 cash withdrawal from my grandmother's trust. $150,000 in total had been drained from the principal investment account. I stared at the numbers as a horrifying realization washed over me. I grew up in that house. I knew exactly what it cost to maintain it. There had been no major renovations. The roof had not been replaced. There had been no massive plumbing disasters or expensive landscaping projects. The house did not require $30,000 a year in basic upkeep. My father had not been using that money to pay the property taxes. He had been liquidating the trust assets and pocketing the cash. My mind immediately flashed back to the county records I had just searched. I thought about Trent's failing tech startup and the massive tax liens filed against him. I thought about Chloe's brand new luxury SUV and their lavish vacations to Cabo. My parents had bankrupted themselves trying to fund Chloe's lifestyle, but when their own money ran out, they did not stop. My father had turned to my grandmother's trust. He had used his power as the trustee to quietly funnel $150,000 of trust money directly into Trent and Chloe's pockets to keep their fake wealthy image alive. But my father made a fatal mathematical miscalculation. By draining $30,000 a year, he had completely depleted the cash reserves. I looked at the most recent bank statement attached to the back of the tax returns. The trust investment account was empty. There was literally nothing left but a few $100s. The property taxes on an $800,000 historic home were coming due, and my father had absolutely no money left to pay them. If the taxes went unpaid, the county would seize the house. That was the real reason behind this sudden, desperate legal petition. That was the reason Robert Sterling was aggressively demanding my signature on a Tuesday afternoon. They had completely drained the cash account, and now they needed to sell the actual physical house to cover their tracks and keep Trent out of bankruptcy. But because I was the legal remainder man, they could not sell the property without my sworn consent. I dropped my red pen onto the desk. The sheer magnitude of my father's betrayal was almost too much to process. When I was 26 years old, he had looked me in the eye and demanded I drain my $30,000 house fund for Chloe's wedding. When I refused, he threw me away and acted like I was dead. But behind the scenes, he had simply stolen that exact same amount of money from my grandmother every single year. What my father had done was not just unethical. It was a severe breach of fiduciary duty. It was federal wire fraud. It was tax evasion. It was outright embezzlement. He had stolen $150,000 from a trust that legally belonged to me. He had committed a major financial crime, and his own arrogant lawyer had just accidentally mailed me the absolute undeniable proof. A profound shift happened inside my brain at that exact moment. The lingering sadness of the discarded daughter completely evaporated. The quiet, obedient girl who used to seek her parents' approval was officially dead and gone. I felt a surge of absolute power rise up in my chest. I was no longer a victim hiding in my office. I was an offensive powerhouse, and I was holding the absolute weapon of their destruction in my hands. My parents thought they could send a fancy lawyer to bully me into giving up my inheritance. They thought I would cower and comply, but they had handed a loaded gun directly to a tax accountant. I carefully gathered the tax returns, the bank statements, and the dissolution petition. I placed them all neatly into my leather briefcase. I was not going to mail anything back. I was not going to hide. I was going to take the rest of the afternoon off. I was going to drive straight to Robert Sterling's expensive downtown office. And I was going to look my parents right in the eye while their entire fake world burned to the ground. I did not go back to my spreadsheets that afternoon. I walked out of my office, holding my leather briefcase tightly against my side. Inside that bag was the absolute destruction of my parents' carefully constructed lives. The drive from my quiet suburban firm to downtown Columbus took exactly 45 minutes, but it felt like an entire lifetime. I watched the highway markers pass by, and with every single mile, the scared, obedient girl I used to be faded further into the rearview mirror. I was 31 years old. I was a senior tax accountant. I paid my own mortgage and bought my own groceries. I did not need Thomas and Susan Hayes to love me. I just needed them to face the absolute consequences of their own greed. Attorney Robert Sterling worked in one of those massive glass and steel high-rises that completely dominate the downtown skyline. It was the kind of building deliberately designed to make ordinary, everyday people feel incredibly small. The massive lobby was covered in imported marble and polished chrome. Security guards in dark suits stood by the elevators. I rode the silent private elevator up to the 40th floor. My heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. I felt absolutely no anxiety. I felt no fear. When you have the undeniable math on your side, you do not have to be afraid of anyone. The receptionist at the front desk was a young woman in a sharp blazer who looked up with a practiced, polite smile. She asked if I had an appointment for today. I told her my name was Abigail Hayes, and I was here for the scheduled family meeting regarding the Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Trust. She checked her computer screen and frowned slightly. She told me Mr. Sterling was already in a private meeting with the Hayes family in the main executive conference room. She asked me to sit in the waiting area while she called to see if they were ready for me to join them. I did not sit down. I thanked her politely and walked straight past her desk down the long carpeted hallway. I knew exactly where the main conference room would be. In these high-end corporate law firms, they always put the biggest, most lucrative clients in the massive corner rooms with the best views of the city. As I approached the heavy mahogany doors of the corner suite, I did not even have to guess if I was in the right place. I could hear their voices echoing clearly through the thick wood. I stopped right outside the door and just listened for a moment. They were laughing. It was a bright, joyful, obnoxious sound. I heard my father Thomas boasting loudly about upgrading to a new premium membership tier at the country club. I heard Trent smoothly discussing the expensive new furniture he was going to buy for his fake startup office. I heard my mother Susan telling the lawyer how incredibly relieved she was that this silly legal hurdle was finally being cleared, so they could all move on with their wealthy lives. They were celebrating. They were sitting inside an expensive law office, happily dividing up the cash they planned to steal from me, and they were actually celebrating. I reached out and pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open. I did not knock. I did not wait or ask for permission to enter. I just walked right into the dead center of their delusional little party. The conference room was absolutely stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire sprawling city of Columbus. A massive polished walnut table sat squarely in the middle of the room. Attorney Robert Sterling sat at the head of the table, sorting through a stack of paperwork with a smug, self-satisfied grin on his face. My parents sat to his right holding crystal glasses of sparkling water. Chloe and Trent sat across from them, completely relaxed. Chloe was showing my mother something on her phone, probably a designer handbag or a luxury vacation package she fully planned to buy with my grandmother's money. The precise moment my shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, the laughter died instantly. It was like someone had sucked all the oxygen straight out of the room. 5 heads snapped in my direction. The pure, unadulterated shock on their faces was absolutely cinematic. For 5 long years they had treated me like a ghost. They had successfully convinced themselves that I was nothing more than a minor administrative nuisance, holding a pen somewhere far away. They honestly believed I would be too intimidated by the wealthy lawyer and too traumatized by their past rejection to ever show my face in public. Seeing me standing there in the flesh, wearing a tailored professional suit and holding a briefcase completely short-circuited their fabricated reality. My sister Chloe literally dropped her phone onto the walnut table. It landed with a loud clatter that echoed sharply in the dead silent room. Trent sat up straight and nervously adjusted his expensive tie, his arrogant smile completely melting into a look of genuine confusion. My father Thomas turned ghost white. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, as if the massive financial crime he had committed over the past 5 years had just physically walked through the door to arrest him. Attorney Robert Sterling was the first one to recover his voice. He stood up from his leather executive chair and smoothed his expensive suit jacket, looking deeply annoyed by the sudden interruption. He told me this was a private legal meeting, and I could not just walk in unannounced. I ignored the lawyer completely. I kept my eyes locked directly on my mother. Susan Hayes sat completely frozen in her chair. The confident, wealthy matriarch facade she wore so proudly every single day was slipping, revealing the panicked, desperate woman hiding underneath. She gripped her crystal water glass so tightly her knuckles were completely white. I walked slowly and deliberately over to the large conference table. I did not say a single word. I simply pulled out the empty leather chair directly across from my parents and sat down. I placed my briefcase on the polished walnut wood right in front of me. The loud snap of the metal latches opening sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. They were expecting a scared little girl, but they had absolutely no idea they were sitting across from their own destruction. For 5 long years, my mother had perfected the art of pretending I did not exist. But sitting in that towering glass office overlooking downtown Columbus, she managed to resurrect her maternal warmth in less than 10 seconds. The absolute silence in the room hung heavy and thick until Susan Hayes decided to flip the script. I watched the genuine panic completely drain from her face, replaced instantly by a bright, artificially sweet smile. She practically leaped out of her leather chair and rushed toward my side of the table with her arms wide open. "Abigail, oh my goodness, it has been so incredibly long." She gushed, her voice dripping with thick, synthetic affection. I did not stand up. I did not uncross my arms. I just stared at her with a flat, cold expression until she awkwardly lowered her hands and hovered right next to my chair. She smelled like expensive department store perfume and absolute desperation. "We are just so happy you could finally make it," Susan continued smoothly, returning to her seat next to my father. She smoothed down her designer skirt and looked around the room as if we were gathering for a pleasant Sunday brunch instead of a hostile legal takeover. "I told your father just this morning how much I missed you. We know you are always so terribly busy with your little tax job, but your grandmother would be absolutely thrilled to see us all sitting together in the same room again. Just sign the paper, sweetheart, and we can all go out for a nice family lunch. My treat." I sat perfectly still, letting her words hang in the sterile air of the conference room. A nice family lunch. My mother had thrown my entire childhood away over a $30,000 wedding bill. She had banned me from every holiday, every birthday, and every family milestone. And now she genuinely believed that a $20 salad at a downtown bistro was the going rate to purchase my $800,000 inheritance. When I did not immediately reach for the pen, my sister Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She let out a loud dramatic sigh and crossed her arms over her chest. "Come on, Abby, do not be weird today," Chloe said, rolling her eyes. "We are all adults here. Trent and I took time out of our extremely busy schedules to be here, and we really need to get back to the office." Trent leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished walnut table. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that I knew for an absolute fact he had purchased on credit. He gave me a slick practice smile, the exact same smile he used to scam his investors. "Abigail, it is just basic economics," Trent said, using a tone you might use to explain a math problem to a slow child. "We need liquid capital right now to scale our tech platform. Your parents are graciously reallocating dormant family assets to foster actual financial growth. The house is just sitting there doing nothing. By signing this document, you are allowing us to leverage that equity and build a massive legacy. It is a win for the whole family. We really need this capital right now." I looked at his smug, confident face. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to tell him that I had already seen the public records. I knew about the bank threatening to foreclose on his custom-built house. I knew about the massive state and federal tax liens suffocating his sham of a company. I was sitting there lecturing me about basic economics, while he was literally days away from total devastating bankruptcy. Chloe reached over and patted Trent's arm, looking at me with that deeply familiar, condescending pity she had weaponized since we were teenagers. "We just really need this money right now, Abby," she added, her voice softening into a fake plea. "You know how incredibly stressful it is to build an empire from scratch. And since you do not have a husband or a family of your own, yet you cannot really understand what it takes to secure a legacy for the next generation. You are just single and working in a cubicle. You do not need a house like that." My father Thomas finally broke his silence. He leaned forward and slammed his hand flat against the table. The sudden loud noise made Chloe jump, but I did not even blink. "Your sister and brother-in-law have a real bright future ahead of them," he demanded, his voice thick with stern paternal authority. "We are doing what is best for the family portfolio. We are making the necessary sacrifices. It is time you finally do your part without making a big dramatic scene. You owe this family, Abigail." Attorney Robert Sterling sensed the rising tension and clearly decided it was the perfect moment to play the heavy-handed authority figure. He cleared his throat loudly and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He picked up the thick 80-page legal petition and slid it across the long, polished table until it rested directly in front of my briefcase. Then he took a heavy gold pen from his inside jacket pocket and placed it deliberately right on top of the signature line. "Miss Hayes," Sterling said, leaning back and steepling his fingers together, "let us look at the harsh legal reality of your situation here. The trust your grandmother set up is essentially defunct in its current practical form. Your parents currently hold the life estate. They pay the property taxes. They carry the financial burden of maintenance. You are merely a nominal remainder man on a piece of paper. You have no actual rights to the property while they are alive." He paused, letting his words sink in, hoping they would terrify me. "If you refuse to sign this mutual dissolution today, we will simply take this matter to probate court. I will personally file a motion for constructive trust termination. I will depose you. I will drag you through years of brutal litigation that will cost you tens of thousands of dollars in personal legal fees out of your own pocket. You will lose anyway. The courts always favor the living tenants in these disputes." Sterling leaned forward again, planting his hands on the table and lowering his voice into a sharp, intimidating growl. "Why put yourself through absolute financial ruin when you can simply sign right here and let your family move forward? Sign the paper, Abigail. Do not ruin your family again." I looked down at the heavy gold pen resting on the white paper. I looked at my mother's fake, hopeful smile. I looked at Chloe's arrogant, entitled posture. I looked at my father's stern, demanding glare. I looked at the high-priced lawyer who thought he could terrify a tax accountant with basic probate threats. They had boxed me in perfectly. They had used guilt, obligations, sibling rivalry, and direct legal intimidation all at once. They were absolutely certain they had won. I looked at the heavy gold pen sitting on the polished walnut table. I looked at the expectant faces surrounding me. For 26 years of my life, this exact scenario would have completely broken me. I would have felt the familiar, crushing weight of my mother's disappointment pressing down on my chest. I would have heard my father's booming voice echoing in my ears telling me how useless I was. I would have picked up that pen with shaking fingers and signed away my entire future just to buy a fleeting temporary moment of their conditional fake love. But the woman sitting in that leather chair was not the scared little girl they had thrown out 5 years ago. I did not feel small. I did not feel intimidated. Looking at their desperate, greedy faces, I only felt one thing. A laugh began to bubble up deep inside my chest. It started as a small, sharp breath, and then it grew. It rose up through my throat and spilled out into the dead silent conference room. It was not a nervous giggle. It was not a hysterical sob. It was a genuine, deep, chilling laugh of absolute pure clarity. I threw my head back and laughed at the sheer pathetic absurdity of it all. I laughed at my mother's perfectly manicured hands gripping her sparkling water. I laughed at Chloe's arrogant pout. I laughed at Trent's cheap custom suit bought with borrowed money. And I laughed at attorney Robert Sterling with his expensive silk tie and his hollow legal threats. The sound of my laughter bounced off the floor-to-ceiling windows and shattered their carefully constructed illusion of control. The confident, smug smiles vanished from their faces instantly. My mother Susan physically recoiled in her chair as if I had just slapped her across the face. She stared at me with her mouth hanging wide open in utter disbelief. Chloe blinked rapidly, looking around the room like she was trying to figure out if this was some kind of bizarre prank. My father Thomas turned a deep shade of angry red. "What on earth is so funny?" "Abigail," my mother demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rising panic. "You are acting completely unhinged." I did not answer her right away. I let the final echo of my laughter fade into the sterile air of the executive suite. Then I reached forward and picked up the heavy gold pen that Sterling had pushed toward me. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the cold metal. I did not uncap it. Instead, I placed my index finger on the center of the pen and slowly, deliberately slid it all the way back across the polished walnut table. It stopped right in front of the lawyer. I reached down to the metal latches of my leather briefcase. I popped them open and pulled out a thick stack of papers. It was not their pristine blank waiver form. It was a copy of the Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Living Trust, fully annotated and completely covered in my bright red ink. Alongside it, I pulled out the tax schedules, the bank statements, and the public records I had printed that afternoon. I dropped the entire stack onto the center of the table right on top of their fraudulent documents. I looked directly into my sister's wide, terrified eyes, and then shifted my gaze to her husband. "I am not signing away my house to pay for Trent's failed startup," I said clearly and firmly. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a bomb dropping right before the shockwave hits. Trent's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. Chloe let out a sharp gasp and covered her mouth with both hands, looking frantically from the documents on the table to her husband's terrified face. She had no idea how I knew. She had no idea that her carefully guarded financial ruin, her pre-foreclosure notices, and her husband's looming bankruptcy were sitting right there in bright red ink for everyone to see. But the shock did not last long. It was immediately swallowed by an explosion of absolute blind fury from my parents. My father Thomas shot to his feet so fast, his heavy leather chair slammed into the glass wall behind him. He slammed both of his fists onto the conference table, rattling the crystal water glasses. "How dare you!" he roared, his voice echoing like thunder. "How dare you come in here and speak to your family this way? You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You are an arrogant, selfish little girl who has never understood the sacrifices we make for this family." My mother Susan was right behind him. She stood up, her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage. The polite suburban matriarch completely vanished. "You ungrateful, vicious brat!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "We raised you. We gave you everything. And you are going to sit there hoarding a house you do not even need while your sister is struggling. You have always been jealous of Chloe. You have always tried to ruin her happiness. You are a cold, bitter spinster sitting in a cubicle doing nothing with your life. You owe us that house, Abigail. You owe your sister." The sheer volume of their screaming would have terrified anyone else. Attorney Sterling looked completely horrified by the sudden lack of wealthy decorum and sank lower into his chair. but I just sat there perfectly calm, letting their toxic words wash over me without leaving a single mark. I watched them completely unravel. They were throwing a massive adult temper tantrum because their favorite scapegoat had finally refused to fall in line. They called me selfish for wanting to keep what was legally mine. They called me ungrateful for refusing to be robbed blind. They screamed about family and loyalty and sacrifice while actively trying to steal my entire future. I let them shout until their faces were purple and they ran out of breath. I let them exhaust themselves in their own desperate panic. And when the room finally fell quiet again, leaving only the sound of my father's heavy breathing, I placed my hands flat on the polished wood. I was no longer the defensive victim backing away from their abuse. I was in complete control, and I had one more massive truth left to drop on the table. I sat perfectly still, letting the echoes of my mother's unhinged screaming slowly fade into the plush carpet of the executive conference room. My father was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive golf shirt, his face still flushed with arrogant rage. Chloe was glaring at me with pure venom, while Trent nervously checked his gold watch. They had exhausted their arsenal of guilt trips and temper tantrums. Now it was my turn. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached into the center of the polished walnut table and pulled my red-inked copy of the Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Living Trust toward me. I smoothed my hand flat across the heavy parchment paper. I shifted my gaze away from my frantic family and looked directly at attorney Robert Sterling. He was leaning back in his leather chair, looking profoundly uncomfortable with the emotional scene that had just played out in his pristine office. He thought the hard part was over. He was about to find out it had not even begun. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the thick tension. "You are clearly a very expensive lawyer. You have a beautiful office and a very nice suit. But you made a massive fatal mistake when you took on this case. You assumed that because my parents were willing to pay your exorbitant retainer, they actually owned the asset they were hiring you to liquidate. And more importantly, you assumed that a tax accountant would not read the original foundational documents of the trust before attending a meeting about its dissolution." Sterling frowned, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in a sharp line of confusion. "I assure you, Miss Hayes, I have reviewed the trust," he began, his voice dripping with defensive condescension. "Then you must have skimmed it," I interrupted sharply, refusing to let him control the room for another second. "Because if you had actually read it with the careful attention it requires, you would have never drafted this ridiculous petition. You would have never called me into this office. In fact, you would have told my parents to walk out your door and never bring this up again." I flipped my copy of the trust open. I turned past the schedules, past the definitions, and stopped deliberately on page 14. It was wonderfully poetic that my grandmother's ultimate protective measure was located on the exact same page number as the fraudulent waiver they had just tried to force me to sign. I looked at my father. His angry flush was beginning to recede, replaced by a creeping cold uncertainty. "My grandmother knew exactly who you were, Thomas," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "She knew you would eventually run out of your own money trying to impress your country club friends. She knew you would try to bleed her estate dry to fund Chloe's ridiculous lifestyle. That is why she made you a life tenant. But she also knew that a life estate alone might not be enough to stop you if you got desperate enough. So she built in a failsafe, a poison pill." I looked down at the heavy parchment paper and placed my finger directly under the bolded heading of Clause 7. I took a deep, steadying breath and began to read the legal text aloud to the dead silent room. Clause 7. Revocation of life estate due to breach. I read clearly, making sure the words echoed off the glass walls. Any attempt by the life tenants, acting either independently or through legal counsel to encumber, sell, liquidate, or otherwise dissolve this trust, without the prior expressly written and notarized consent of the remainder man, shall constitute a fundamental and immediate breach of fiduciary duty. I paused, letting the heavy legal terminology hang in the air. Chloe looked confused. Trent was staring at me with his jaw slightly slack. But Attorney Sterling suddenly sat bolt upright in his chair. The smug, bored expression was completely wiped from his face. I kept reading, delivering the final devastating blow. "Upon such breach, the life estate granted to Thomas and Susan Hayes shall be immediately and permanently revoked. All rights of residency, use, and access shall be terminated and full legal, physical, and financial possession of the property shall automatically transfer to the sole remainderman Abigail Marie Hayes. I closed the document and let it drop onto the table. The silence in the room was absolute. It was deafening. My mother blinked rapidly, looking back and forth between me and her lawyer. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice shrill and trembling. "Robert, what is she talking about? What does that clause mean?" Sterling did not answer her. He could not answer her. The high-priced, arrogant downtown lawyer had just turned a sickening shade of ghost white. His mouth was slightly open, and a visible bead of sweat had formed at his hairline. He was staring at my copy of the trust, like it was a venomous snake preparing to strike. He realized exactly what he had just done. "I will tell you exactly what it means, Susan," I said, leaning forward and folding my hands on the table. "It means my grandmother set a trap, and your own lawyer just walked you right into it. By drafting a formal legal petition to dissolve the trust and sell the house, and by presenting it to me today without my prior written consent, you triggered Clause 7. You breached the trust." I watched the devastating reality wash over my father's face. The arrogant, demanding patriarch was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken old man. "You legally evicted yourselves," I told them, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable finality. "The life estate is officially terminated. You no longer have the right to live in that house. You do not own the property. You do not control the property. And as of this exact moment, you are trespassing on my property." Trent let out a strangled, desperate sound. He grabbed his hair with both hands, his custom suit suddenly looking cheap and wrinkled. The realization that there was no magical bailout, no hidden cash to save his fraudulent tech startup was crashing down on him. He was going to bankruptcy court, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chloe burst into actual, genuine tears. Not the performative, dramatic crying she used to manipulate our parents, but deep, ugly sobs of pure panic. "But we need that money," she wailed, clutching my mother's arm. "Mom, you promised. You promised we could pay off the bank." My mother could not comfort her. Susan Hayes was staring at me with wide, horrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her loss. The beautiful, historic home she used to host her lavish parties, the estate she used to project her flawless, wealthy image, was gone. She was about to be homeless, and every single person at her country club was going to know exactly why. "You threw me out like garbage 5 years ago to protect your precious golden child," I said, looking at my parents one last time. "You tried to steal my future to cover up your own pathetic financial failures. But you underestimated my grandmother, and you drastically underestimated me." I calmly zipped up my leather briefcase, ignoring the chaotic sounds of Chloe's sobbing and Trent's panicked muttering. Attorney Sterling was still frozen in his chair, contemplating the massive malpractice lawsuit that was undoubtedly heading his way. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. I did not look back. I had my grandmother's house. I had my freedom, and justice had finally been served. The mahogany doors closed behind me with a solid thud. I walked down the carpeted hallway of that expensive law firm and did not look back. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm. I had just dropped a nuclear bomb on my parents' fabricated lives. They thought I was a naive girl they could bully into giving up an $800,000 estate. Instead, I had triggered a legal clause that completely revoked their right to live in my grandmother's house. As I stepped into the elevator, the rush of adrenaline faded, leaving behind absolute clarity. I knew my mother Susan and my father Thomas better than anyone. Desperate people facing absolute public humiliation do not quietly walk away. They were going to fight back. They were going to try to burn my grandmother's legacy to the ground out of pure vindictive spite. I knew I needed a lawyer. I did not need a polite family attorney who wanted to negotiate a peaceful settlement. I needed an absolute shark. As a senior tax accountant, I knew exactly who to call. I had spent years analyzing financial records for high net worth clients and had seen the messy aftermath of the most brutal estate battles in Columbus. There was one name that always appeared on the winning side of those documents: David Harrington. David was a ruthless, brilliant estate litigation attorney. He did not care about preserving family harmony. He cared entirely about the absolute letter of the law and took immense professional pleasure in destroying people who manipulated the legal system for greed. I sat in my car and dialed his direct line. I told his secretary I needed an emergency consultation regarding a breached irrevocable living trust and a massive documented case of fiduciary embezzlement. 2 hours later, I was sitting in his private office. David was a sharp-featured man who listened to my entire story without interrupting a single time. I laid out the annotated trust document, the tax schedules proving my father had stolen $150,000, and the pre-foreclosure notices for my sister's house. David looked at the stack of paperwork, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He told me attorney Robert Sterling was an absolute fool for trying to execute a waiver without reading the trust provisions. David confirmed that Clause 7 was valid and actively triggered. My parents had legally evicted themselves the exact moment they presented me with that dissolution petition. But then David's expression turned dead serious. He leaned across his heavy mahogany desk and asked me a question that made my blood run cold. He asked what was currently sitting inside my grandmother's house. I told him the house was fully furnished. My grandmother had spent her entire life collecting rare antique furniture, original oil paintings, Persian rugs, and incredibly valuable silver tea sets. David shook his head and told me I needed to stop thinking like a rational professional and start thinking like a cornered animal. I explained that my parents had just realized they permanently lost an $800,000 piece of real estate. They knew they were about to be homeless, and they knew Trent and Chloe were bankrupt. David warned me that by tonight, my parents would realize they still had physical access to the inside of the estate. Out of spite and desperate greed, they would start loading every single piece of antique furniture and valuable silver into moving trucks. They would sell my grandmother's precious belongings to pawn shops and private buyers to squeeze every last penny out of the property before the courts locked them out. The thought of my mother tearing down my grandmother's beautiful oil paintings and tossing them into the back of a rented truck made me physically sick. My grandmother had trusted me to protect her legacy, and I was not going to let them strip her historic house bare. I looked at David and asked him exactly how we stopped them. David did not hesitate for a single second. He told me we were going to drop a massive legal anvil on their heads before they even had time to pack a cardboard box. He pulled out a fresh stack of legal paper and began drafting a temporary restraining order. A temporary restraining order in an estate litigation case is an absolute financial freeze. David specifically drafted the emergency order to completely lock down every physical asset inside that house. The document explicitly stated that Thomas and Susan Hayes were legally forbidden from removing, selling, altering, or damaging any property, furniture, fixtures, or personal items located on the premises. David attached my sworn affidavit, the proof of the trust's remainderment clause, and the undisputed tax evidence of my father's embezzlement. It was a flawless legal strike designed to trap them exactly where they stood. Because of the clear mathematical evidence of financial fraud, David pushed the filing through an emergency judicial review within a single hour. By 4 p.m, a county sheriff deputy was standing on the front porch of my grandmother's historic estate. He knocked on the heavy oak door with the freshly signed temporary restraining order in his hand. I sat in my car, parked down the street, hidden from view, watching the entire scene unfold. I watched my father open the front door. He looked pale and exhausted from the disaster at the law office. I watched the deputy hand him the thick legal envelope. I saw my father open the document and read the first page. Even from a distance, I could see his shoulders slump in total defeat. He realized he was completely trapped. He could not sell the house. He could not loot the antiques. He could not access a single dime of my grandmother's money. The gilded cage they had been living in was finally locked from the outside, and I was the one holding the only key. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp chill. I kept a quiet routine of attending the early 8 o'clock service at Grace Fellowship. It was the same wealthy suburban church my parents attended, but they always went to the highly social 11 o'clock service to be seen. By attending early, I avoided them. But this particular Sunday, the early service let out 30 minutes late. As I walked down the wide stone steps, the parking lot was already swarming with the late morning crowd. Women in designer dresses and men in tailored suits greeted each other. I kept my head down and walked briskly toward my reliable old car, just wanting to go home. I had my keys in my hand when I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of high heels marching across the asphalt. I turned around and saw my mother Susan and my sister Chloe storming directly toward me. My mother's face was flushed with rage, and Chloe's eyes were wide with dramatic fury. They had clearly spent the weekend seething over the temporary restraining order, blocked from looting my grandmother's antique furniture. Their anger had boiled over into reckless desperation. My mother wanted an audience. She wanted to publicly humiliate me right in front of the congregation she valued so much. "Abigail, you stop right there!" My mother shouted, her voice echoing loudly over the polite murmurs of the arriving churchgoers. "Do not you dare try to run away from us." Several families stopped walking and turned to stare. People I had known since childhood halted in their tracks. I did not run. I stood perfectly still with my back against my car. 5 years ago, this exact public spectacle would have crushed me. But today, I just felt a cold, analytical calm. I let them put on their little show. Chloe stepped forward and pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "How could you be so incredibly selfish?" she cried out, using her best theatrical sob. "You are putting a lock on our house and trying to throw us out into the street. We are your blood, and you are acting like a ruthless monster." My mother instantly chimed in, raising her voice even louder to ensure the lingering church elders heard every single word. "You are a thief, Abigail," my mother shrieked, waving her designer handbag. "You manipulated your poor sick grandmother into signing away our home. You are a complete disgrace to this family and to this church." The crowd of wealthy onlookers was completely silent, drinking in the dramatic scandal. They were looking at me like I was a criminal. My mother stood tall, basking in the glow of her perceived victory. She thought public shaming would break my spirit and force me to drop the restraining order. She fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. A tax accountant knows that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the weakest case. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, closing the distance until I was standing less than a foot away from my mother's flushed, angry face. She instinctively took a tiny half-step back, intimidated by my absolute lack of fear. I leaned in close, invading her personal space, so that my words were meant exclusively for her and Chloe. I lowered my voice into a dangerous, icy whisper that only the two of them could hear. "You want to talk about stealing, Susan?" I whispered, my tone flat and lethal. "Let us talk about the $150,000 Thomas embezzled from the trust to pay for Chloe's designer clothes. Let us talk about the fact that you do not own a single brick of that house." My mother flinched, her eyes darting nervously side to side. Chloe opened her mouth to argue, but I immediately cut her off. "And let us talk about Trent," I continued, my voice dropping even lower. "I pulled his corporate filings, Chloe. I know his startup is a total fraud. I know your house is in pre-foreclosure. And most importantly, I saw the massive federal tax liens the IRS filed against his fake company for unpaid payroll taxes." Chloe's jaw dropped open and all the color rapidly drained from her face. My mother tried to maintain her fierce glare, but her hands began to shake uncontrollably. I kept my eyes locked onto my mother's terrified face and delivered the final blow. "If you ever scream at me in public again," I whispered slowly, "if you try to fight my lawyer or take a single silver spoon out of my grandmother's house, I will personally hand-deliver Trent's fraudulent tax documents to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. I will let them audit every penny you and Thomas funneled to him from the trust. Trent will go to federal prison, and you will both be dragged right down with him." The fierce, righteous indignation completely vanished from my mother's eyes, leaving nothing behind but pure, unadulterated terror. She finally realized the massive, catastrophic danger she was in. She was fighting a financial expert who held the absolute power to destroy her husband, her favorite daughter, and her son-in-law with a single phone call. My mother literally recoiled from me, stumbling backward in her expensive heels. She grabbed Chloe's arm with a frantic, desperate grip. "We are leaving," Susan hissed, her voice completely stripped of its performative volume. Chloe was staring at me with tears of genuine panic welling up in her eyes, but my mother dragged her away before she could speak. They practically ran across the parking lot, fleeing toward their luxury SUV. They did not say another word to the watching congregation. They just got into their car and sped out of the church parking lot, leaving a trail of confused whispers in their wake. I stood by my reliable old car and watched them disappear. The morning sun felt warm on my face. I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The heavy chains of family obligation that had bound me for my entire life were completely broken. I walked into the deposition room on a rainy Tuesday morning. The room was completely different from the luxurious high-rise office where my parents had tried to intimidate me. This was a sterile, windowless conference room in a neutral legal building. There was no polished walnut table and no sweeping view of the city. There was only a cheap laminate table, a ticking clock, and a certified court reporter setting up her stenography machine. My attorney David sat next to me, organizing his files with the calm precision of a surgeon preparing for a major operation. He had specifically requested this deposition. He told me that when you are dealing with arrogant people who are used to lying their way out of trouble, you do not argue with them. You simply put them under oath and let their own massive egos do the heavy lifting. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy door swung open. My father Thomas walked into the room, followed closely by his attorney Robert Sterling. My mother and Chloe were not allowed inside. My father was wearing his best tailored suit, projecting the image of a wealthy, put-together patriarch. He did not look like a man who was facing total financial ruin or a man who had just been legally locked out of his own home. He looked annoyed. He shot me a glare of pure absolute disgust before taking his seat across from David. He honestly believed this deposition was just another minor inconvenience. I thought he could just show up, charm the room, tell a few white lies, and go back to his country club. He had absolutely no respect for the legal process and even less respect for me. The court reporter asked my father to raise his right hand. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He said the words with a dismissive little sigh, as if the oath was just a silly formality. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. As a tax accountant, I have sat through dozens of tense legal audits. I knew exactly what was about to happen. When people commit major financial fraud, their biggest weakness is always their own arrogance. They think they are the smartest person in the room. They assume they can outsmart the paper trail. David began the questioning with a slow, methodical pace. He started with basic background information establishing my father's role as the sole financial trustee of my grandmother's estate. My father answered the questions loudly and confidently. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers and happily boasting about how well he had managed the property over the past 5 years. He painted a beautiful picture of a devoted son who had sacrificed his own time to preserve his mother's historic home. Attorney Sterling looked relaxed, completely unaware that David was just lulling my father into a false sense of total security. Then the tone of the room shifted. David slowly opened his black leather folder and pulled out the trust tax schedules. The exact same tax returns that proved my father had been quietly draining the principal investment account. David slid the first document across the table. He asked my father to verify his signature on the bottom of the page. My father glanced at it and confidently confirmed it was his. Then David read the distribution line out loud. He noted that exactly $30,000 had been withdrawn from the trust account in that specific tax year. He asked my father to explain exactly where that money went. I watched my father closely. He did not blink. He did not sweat. He had clearly spent the last few weeks rehearsing his lie. He looked David straight in the eye and stated that every single penny of that $30,000 was spent on necessary house maintenance and property upkeep. David nodded slowly, acting as if this was a completely reasonable answer. He then pulled out the tax returns for the next 4 years. He laid them out in a neat row across the laminate table. He pointed out that exactly $30,000 had been withdrawn every single year for 5 consecutive years, totaling $150,000. He asked my father if all of that money was also used for house maintenance. My father doubled down. He puffed out his chest and raised his voice, sounding deeply offended that his integrity was being questioned. He stated for the official legal record that historic homes are incredibly expensive to maintain. He claimed the house needed a brand new slate roof. He claimed the foundation had cracked and required massive structural repairs. He talked about replacing the entire heating and cooling system and hiring high-end landscapers to fix the grounds. He spun a brilliant, detailed story about saving the family home from total ruin. David did not challenge him. He did not pull out evidence to prove him wrong. He just kept asking for more details. He asked for the names of the contractors. My father casually waved his hand and claimed he used independent local workers, who only accepted cash to save the trust money. He claimed he did not keep the receipts because he did not think his own ungrateful daughter would ever drag him into court over basic family expenses. He was incredibly proud of himself. He thought he was completely outsmarting the ruthless estate lawyer. He thought his answers were flawless, but I knew the absolute truth. I grew up in that house. I knew for a fact that the roof had not been replaced since I was in high school. The foundation was perfectly fine. The heating system was the exact same noisy unit it had always been. My father had not spent a single dime on that house. He had funneled all $150,000 directly to Chloe and Trent to keep their fake wealthy lifestyle afloat. Attorney Sterling suddenly sat forward, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. A good lawyer knows when his client is talking too much. Sterling tried to interject, trying to stop the line of questioning, but it was far too late. David had already asked the final, most important question. He looked at my father and asked him if he was absolutely certain, under penalty of perjury, that the $150,000 was spent exclusively on the physical property and not distributed to any other family members. My father glared at David and firmly stated yes. The court reporter typed the final word. The soft clicking of her machine was the only sound in the room. My father crossed his arms, looking incredibly smug. He had no idea what he had just done. He thought he had successfully talked his way out of a corner. But as a professional auditor, I knew the reality. My father had just committed felony perjury on a federal legal record. He had permanently locked himself into a story that could easily be disproven by a single basic property inspection and a standard bank audit. David quietly closed his leather folder. He looked over at me and gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. The trap had officially snapped shut. My father had walked into this room hoping to legally protect his stolen money. Instead, he had just handed us the absolute, undisputable proof we needed to send him straight to a criminal courtroom. The deposition was over, and my father had completely destroyed himself. My father sat there looking incredibly pleased with his own lies. He thought he had completely outsmarted us. He had no idea David had subpoenaed my brother-in-law Trent for the exact same afternoon. As the heavy wooden door opened and Trent walked into the sterile conference room, adjusting his expensive silk tie, he looked just as arrogant as my father. I took the seat next to Thomas, giving me a condescending little smirk. He thought this was just a ridiculous family dispute over an old house and some misunderstood maintenance bills. He did not realize he was walking directly into a federal financial trap. David did not waste any time with pleasantries. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I felt my heartbeat steady. This was the moment I had been working toward for 5 long years. David calmly opened the envelope and pulled out a massive stack of documents. They were not tax returns this time. They were copies of canceled checks. 36 individual checks to be exact. David slid the first batch across the laminate table directly toward Trent and my father. My father looked down, and the arrogant smirk instantly melted off his face. I had used my skills as a tax accountant to dig through the trust accounts routing numbers. I had found exactly where that $150,000 of supposed house maintenance money had gone. It had not gone to contractors or roofers or plumbers. Every single check was made out to a company called Apex Solutions. It was a shell company registered in Delaware, and the sole registered owner of Apex Solutions was Trent. David leaned forward and looked Trent dead in the eye. He listed the dates and the exact dollar amounts of every single transfer. He then presented the incorporation documents proving Trent owned the dummy corporation. David kept his voice completely level and professional as he explained the legal reality of what they were looking at. He told Trent that accepting money embezzled from an irrevocable trust using a fake corporate entity across state lines was not just a simple civil family matter. It was federal wire fraud. And failing to report that $150,000 of stolen income on his corporate tax returns was federal tax evasion. The room went completely silent. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a heavy sledgehammer against the drywall. I watched Trent's face cycle through a dozen different emotions in a matter of seconds. Annoyance turned to extreme confusion. Confusion turned to rising fear, and that fear rapidly spiraled into absolute unadulterated terror. He looked at the canceled checks bearing his own forged endorsement signatures, and then he looked at David. Trent was a slick con artist, but he was not stupid. I knew exactly what the federal government did to people who engaged in interstate wire fraud and blatant tax evasion. He was looking at years in a federal prison. The confident tech entrepreneur vanished completely. He started to sweat profusely. He loosened his silk tie, pulling at his collar like he suddenly could not breathe. He looked over at my father, expecting Thomas to fix it, to say something to make the nightmare go away. But my father was frozen. Thomas sat rigidly in his chair, staring blankly at the copies of the checks. He had nothing left to say. His lies had trapped him, and now the physical evidence was sitting right on the table in front of a certified court reporter. Seeing my father paralyzed with fear pushed Trent right over the edge. The illusion of their perfect wealthy family shattered into a million jagged pieces. Trent leaped out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the floor with a loud crash. "It was his idea," Trent screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my father. "He told me to set up the company. He said the trust had too much cash sitting around and we needed to hide it from Abigail. I did not want to do it. He forced me to do it." Attorney Robert Sterling jumped up, waving his hands and shouting for everyone to stop talking immediately. But the floodgates were wide open, and Trent could not be stopped. He was sobbing now, completely breaking down on the official legal record. He told the court reporter that Thomas had masterminded the entire embezzlement scheme to cover Trent's massive business debts, because Thomas could not bear the public embarrassment of his favorite daughter marrying a bankrupt failure. My father suddenly snapped out of his shock. He stood up and lunged at Trent, his face purple with absolute rage. "You spineless, pathetic coward!" Thomas roared, grabbing Trent by the collar of his expensive suit. "I gave you that money to save you and Chloe. You came to me begging like a dog." They were screaming at each other, physically struggling right in the middle of the deposition room. The court reporter was furiously typing every single incriminating word they shouted. They were throwing each other under the bus, admitting to multiple federal crimes on the official record, just to save their own skin. Their perfect, flawless family dynamic was completely destroyed. They had spent my entire life telling me I was the broken one. They had thrown me out like garbage because I refused to play their toxic games, and now they were tearing each other apart like wild animals over stolen money. David sat back in his chair and watched the chaos with a calm, highly satisfied expression. He did not try to stop them. He just let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly could. I looked at the two men screaming and cursing at each other across the cheap laminate table. I felt no pity for either of them. I felt no sorrow for the family I was losing. I only felt a deep, incredible sense of peace. The truth was finally out in the open for the entire world to see. The lies they had used to build their fake empire had completely collapsed. They had tried to ruin my life to protect their image, and instead they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy theirs. I picked up my briefcase and quietly watched them drown in the toxic mess they had created for themselves. The perfect family was dead, and I was finally free. The heir and attorney. David Harrington's office felt incredibly light when I walked in 3 days after the disastrous deposition. For 5 long years, the heavy, crushing weight of my parents' rejection had sat squarely on my chest. They had thrown me out of my childhood home, over a $30,000 wedding bill, tossing my entire existence aside to protect Chloe's perfect suburban illusion. But sitting across from David, looking at the pristine stack of legal documents resting on his desk, I finally felt that suffocating weight begin to lift. We had the canceled checks. We had the sworn court transcripts of my father committing blatant federal perjury. We had Trent's hysterical on-the-record confession of wire fraud. The trap had not just closed around them, it had completely crushed their fabricated reality. David gave me a sharp, satisfied smile and slid a single thick piece of paper across the desk. It was not a request for a meeting or a demand for a settlement. It was a formal, legally binding 60-day notice to vacate the premises. Because my parents had deliberately breached the Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Living Trust by attempting to sell the property without my consent, their life estate was instantly and permanently revoked. They were no longer the lords of the manor. Legally speaking, they were nothing more than hostile trespassers occupying an $800,000 estate that belonged entirely to me. David explained that we could easily have the local sheriff's department drag them out by the end of the week given the documented financial crimes. But we chose to give them exactly 60 days. Not out of kindness or residual family loyalty, but because David wanted the agonizing reality of their downfall to sink in slowly. I wanted them to wake up every single morning for 2 entire months, knowing they were packing their bags because their own arrogant greed had rendered them completely homeless. I wanted to be there when the notice was finally served. I did not want to yell or make a dramatic scene. I just needed to watch the power dynamic permanently shift. At exactly 10 in the morning on a crisp Thursday, I parked my reliable old car across the street from the massive historic estate I grew up in. The manicured lawn looked perfectly green, and the large bay windows reflected the morning sun. It looked exactly like the flawless, wealthy sanctuary my mother had always pretended it was. A sleek black car pulled into the circular driveway, and a licensed process server stepped out, holding a thick manila envelope. I rolled my window down just enough to hear the exchange. The heavy oak front door swung open. My father Thomas stood there wearing his expensive cashmere sweater and holding a cup of gourmet coffee. He looked highly annoyed at the interruption, probably expecting a delivery driver or a hired landscaper. The process server simply asked to confirm his identity, handed over the envelope, and walked away without another word. I watched my father tear open the seal. For a long, terrifying moment, the neighborhood was completely silent. Then the coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered against the stone porch, spilling dark liquid all over his expensive leather loafers. My mother Susan hurried out the front door a few seconds later, alarmed by the sound of breaking ceramic. She grabbed the legal document from my father's trembling hands. Even from across the street, I could see the exact moment her perfect wealthy world stopped spinning. Her knees actually buckled, and she had to grab the thick wooden doorframe just to keep from collapsing onto the wet stone. She let out a high-pitched wailing sound that cut through the quiet suburban morning. It was the sound of a woman realizing that all her country club friends, all her high society neighbors, and everyone she had ever lied to would soon watch a moving truck haul away her entire carefully constructed life. I stepped out of my car and closed the door with a solid thud. The sudden sound made them both snap their heads in my direction. We stared at each other across the manicured lawn. 5 years ago, they had stood on that exact same porch and watched me drag my cheap suitcases down the driveway, crying and begging them to love me. They had looked down at me with cold, disgusted eyes, completely convinced that I was worthless, and that they held all the power. Now the roles were completely and utterly reversed. They were the one standing on the porch trembling and broken, and I was the one holding the deed to the entire property. Abigail, my mother, choked out her voice, carrying across the quiet street. Please, you cannot do this to us. Where are we supposed to go? We do not have any money left. Trent lost everything. You cannot throw your own family out into the street. I walked slowly up to the edge of the property line, but I did not set foot on the grass. I looked at the woman who had banned me from every holiday, and the man who had stolen $150,000 of my grandmother's money. You threw me out of this house with absolutely nothing. I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. I survived. I built a life. I built a career. You have exactly 60 days to figure out how to do the same. That is 59 more days of mercy than you ever gave me. My father looked like he wanted to scream, to threaten me, to use his booming voice to force me into submission. But he looked at the legal eviction notice in my mother's, shaking hands, and realized he had absolutely no ammunition left. The federal fraud charges were hanging right over his head. If he pushed me even an inch, I would send him straight to a criminal cell. He closed his eyes, defeated, and turned back toward the dark, empty foyer of the house he no longer owned. I did not wait for my mother to stop crying. I simply turned around, walked back to my car, and drove it away. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. True justice does not require apologies from the people who hurt you. True justice is reclaiming your life and letting the people who tried to destroy you face the exact consequences they engineered for themselves. I finally had my grandmother's home, and for the first time in my entire life, I had genuine total peace. It had been exactly 3 days since the eviction notice was served at my grandmother's estate. I was sitting at my desk at the accounting firm, enjoying the quiet hum of the office. The morning was perfectly ordinary. I was reviewing a quarterly tax schedule for a corporate client and sipping my coffee. The sterile calm of the financial firm was exactly the kind of predictable environment I loved, I had spent my entire life navigating the chaotic emotional minefields my parents set up, so this quiet professional space was my sanctuary. But that sanctuary was about to be violently invaded. Around 11 in the morning, the heavy glass doors at the front of the suite flew open with a loud, violent crash. I heard our receptionist let out a sharp gasp, followed immediately by the sound of scuffling shoes. Then I heard a voice that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was my mother. But it was not the polished country club voice she used at charity luncheons. It was a raw, hysterical screech that echoed down the long hallway of cubicles and private offices. "Where is she?" My mother screamed, her voice cracking with absolute lunacy. "Where is that ungrateful little thief? Bring her out here right now." I stood up slowly and stepped out of my cubicle. Every single accountant, junior associate, and managing partner in the firm had stopped working. Dozens of heads popped up over the cubicle dividers. At the end of the hallway stood Susan Hayes. I almost did not recognize her. The woman who spent 2 hours every morning perfecting her hair and makeup looked completely unhinged. Her designer blouse was wrinkled and untucked. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess, and her eyes were wide and bloodshot with pure, frantic panic. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire fake reality burn to the ground. Because she had. When her wild eyes finally locked onto me, she let out a sound that was half sob and half growl. She stomped down the carpeted hallway, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "There you are, you vicious little monster!" she shrieked, ignoring the stunned gasps of my coworkers. "You are going to call off your ruthless bulldog of a lawyer right now, Abigail. You are going to tear up that eviction notice, or I swear I will ruin your life just like you ruined your sister's." I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink back. I just stood there perfectly calm with my hands clasped in front of me. "Susan," I said, keeping my tone completely flat and professional. "You need to leave this building immediately." My calm demeanor only threw gas on her raging fire. She completely lost whatever tiny grip on reality she had left. She turned toward my managing partner, who had just stepped out of his corner office, looking completely bewildered. "You need to fire her!" my mother screamed at him, waving her arms frantically. "She is a criminal. She manipulated a dying woman to steal our family home. She is putting her own parents out on the street. You cannot employ a monster like this. She is a fraud and a thief." My managing partner looked at her with pure professional disgust. He did not say a word to her. He simply looked past her frantic, flailing arms and made eye contact with me. I gave him a very small, reassuring nod. I did not need to defend myself to him. He knew my character, and he recognized a desperate, unhinged person when he saw one. I turned to the receptionist, who was clutching her desk phone with wide, terrified eyes. "Please call building security," I instructed her clearly and calmly. "Tell them we have a hostile trespasser refusing to leave the premises." Hearing me call security pushed my mother over the absolute edge. She lunged forward, trying to grab the lapels of my blazer. "How can you be so cold?" she sobbed violently, her tears ruining her expensive makeup. "We are your family. We raised you. We gave you everything, and you are destroying us over an old house. You have to stop this, Abigail. You have to give it back." I stepped back easily, avoiding her frantic grasp. "I did not take anything from you," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent office. "You threw it away. You legally breached the trust because you and Thomas were too greedy to follow the rules. You destroyed yourselves. Now you are trespassing and you are going to be removed." Right on cue. The elevator dinged and 2 large building security guards stepped onto our floor. They took one look at my mother, who was still screaming and sobbing in the middle of the professional firm, and immediately moved to intercept her. They grabbed her by the arms gently but firmly, pulling her away from my workspace. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, thrashing against the guards like a wild animal. "You cannot do this to me. I am her mother. She is stealing my home. She is ruining my life." They dragged her backward down the hallway. Her expensive designer heels dragged against the carpet. My entire firm watched in total shocked silence as Susan Hayes, the woman who cared about public appearances more than she cared about her own children, was physically hauled into the elevator. Her hysterical screams echoed through the lobby until the heavy metal doors finally slid shut, cutting her off completely. The office remained dead silent for a long moment. I slowly turned around, smoothed down my blazer, and walked over to my managing partner. I apologized for the disruption, keeping my head held high. He just shook his head, let out a long sigh, and told me to take the rest of the afternoon off to deal with the situation. I did exactly that. But I did not go home to cry. I walked straight to the building management office on the ground floor. I sat down with the head of security and formally requested a digital copy of the lobby and office surveillance footage. They handed over the flash drive without hesitation. They had seen enough crazy family members try to cause trouble in their building. I drove directly to Attorney David Harrington's office and placed the flash drive on his mahogany desk. I told him my mother had just ambushed me at my place of employment, attempted to assault me, and tried to extort me into dropping our legal eviction. David plugged the drive into his computer and watched the footage of my mother completely unraveling in high definition. A dark, satisfied smile spread across his face. I immediately drafted a permanent restraining order. This was no longer just a temporary financial freeze on the estate. This was a full personal protection order. By the next morning, a judge signed the papers legally, barring Susan Thomas and Chloe Hayes from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, or my place of employment. My mother's desperate attempt to intimidate me had only handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to banish them from my life forever. The eviction clock was still ticking, and now they could not even beg me to stop it. 60 days. It had been exactly 60 days since Attorney David Harrington served my parents with the formal notice to vacate my grandmother's estate. I stood on the curb on a chilly, overcast Tuesday morning, watching the clock strike 8. Beside me stood Deputy Miller from the County Sheriff's Department. His presence was not just a formality. Owing to my mother's unhinged ambush at my accounting firm, we had a permanent restraining order in place. My parents were not allowed to approach me, speak to me, or take a single item that belonged to the irrevocable trust. The deputy was there to ensure they packed only their personal clothing and walked away peacefully. I crossed my arms against the crisp morning air and watched the reality of their choices unfold before my eyes. Pulled up onto the pristine circular driveway was a battered yellow rental truck. It had rust along the wheel wells and a loud sputtering exhaust. It was a massive, glaring eyesore against the perfectly manicured landscaping of the historic property. For a woman like my mother, who spent her entire adult life obsessing over appearances and country club status, the cheap rented box truck was the ultimate mark of total defeat. They could not afford professional movers. The federal authorities had frozen Trent's bank accounts, and the massive legal fees were draining my parents completely dry. I watched my father Thomas walk out the heavy oak front doors carrying a large stack of cardboard boxes. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of 2 short months. His posture was slumped and his face was a sickly shade of gray. He was wearing old sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, completely stripped of his usual wealthy patriarch uniform. He struggled to lift the boxes onto the back ramp of the moving truck, his breathing heavy and labored in the cool morning air. My mother Susan followed close behind him, dragging a heavy rolling suitcase. She kept her head down, staring blankly at the pavement. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, and she wore no makeup. The polished, arrogant woman who used to stand in that beautiful foyer hosting lavish charity galas was completely gone. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and entirely broken. I watched them load box after box, completely alone. The grand illusion of their perfect family had violently fractured under the crushing weight of the truth. Chloe and Trent were nowhere to be seen. My parents had stolen $150,000 from my grandmother's trust and handed every single penny over to their golden child. They had literally risked federal prison to save her. But the exact moment the IRS closed in and Trent's fraudulent tech startup completely collapsed, Chloe and Trent packed whatever they could fit into their luxury sport utility vehicle and fled the state. They completely abandoned my parents, leaving them behind to face the terrible legal and financial fallout entirely alone. The daughter my parents had blindly worshipped had taken their stolen money and left them to load their own heavy boxes into a cheap rental truck. The silence of the neighborhood was absolute, but it was not empty. As I stood next to the sheriff, I noticed the subtle movements across the street. The heavy silk curtains in the adjacent mansions were slowly pulled back. The wealthy neighbors, my mother's absolute favorite audience, were standing in their large bay windows, watching the entire humiliating scene unfold. Word travels incredibly fast in elite suburban circles. The country club already knew about the embezzlement. They knew about the temporary restraining order freezing the valuable antiques. They knew about the permanent protection order guarding me from my mother's violent physical outbursts. My mother stopped at the bottom of the truck ramp and looked across the quiet street. She saw Mrs. Henderson, her former bridge partner, watching her from a beautifully manicured front porch. Susan did not wave. Mrs. Henderson did not offer a polite, sympathetic smile. The wealthy neighbor simply turned around and walked back inside her massive home, closing the heavy door on my mother forever. I saw Susan cover her face with her trembling hands. Her social capital, her entire identity was permanently and totally destroyed. She was leaving this exclusive neighborhood not as a respected matriarch, moving to a nicer property, but as an exposed, desperate fraud being legally evicted by her own daughter. Deputy Miller checked his watch and walked slowly up the winding driveway. He approached my father and informed him that their permitted time was officially up. My father did not argue. He did not puff out his chest or make any empty, arrogant threats. He just nodded slowly, reaching deep into the pocket of his faded sweatpants. He pulled out the heavy brass keys to my grandmother's house. He held them out, dropping them quietly into the deputy's outstretched hand. My father turned around and looked at me one final time. He stood by the rusted door of the rental truck and just stared. There was no anger left in his eyes, just a hollow, devastating realization of exactly what he had foolishly thrown away. He had completely discarded a loyal daughter, who would have done anything for him just to protect a selfish golden child who ultimately left him with absolutely nothing. I did not offer a smile or a polite wave. I just looked back at him with total calm indifference until he finally broke eye contact, lowered his head, and climbed into the driver's seat. The cheap rental truck sputtered to life, blowing a thick cloud of dark exhaust over the pristine driveway. I watched as they slowly pulled out of the neighborhood, driving away toward whatever small cheap apartment they had managed to secure. I stood quietly on the curb until the truck turned the corner and disappeared from sight completely. Deputy Miller walked back down the driveway and handed me the heavy brass keys. The metal felt cold and remarkably solid in the palm of my hand. I thanked the officer for his time and waited as he pulled his cruiser away from the curb. The neighborhood was quiet again, but the air felt entirely different. It felt incredibly clean. I walked up the long stone pathway toward the heavy oak doors of the historic estate. I slid the key into the lock, heard the satisfying click, and pushed the door wide open. I stepped into the beautiful grand foyer of my grandmother's house and breathed in the familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood. The ghosts of my parents' toxic abuse were completely gone. I was finally home. The heavy mahogany doors of David Harrington's office closed behind me for what would be one of our final meetings. The 60-day eviction notice had run its course. My parents were physically out of my grandmother's house, but the legal reckoning was far from over. I sat across from David looking at the neat stack of documents outlining the criminal case we had built. My father had stolen $150,000 from an irrevocable trust. He had committed perjury on a federal record, and he had wired that stolen money into a fraudulent shell company owned by his son-in-law. As a tax accountant, I knew exactly how the federal government handled that specific combination of crimes. They did not offer slap-on-the-wrist plea deals. They handed out mandatory federal prison sentences. David leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands. He told me we had a choice to make. We could hand the entire file over to the district attorney and watch my father go to trial in handcuffs, or we could offer him a single non-negotiable ultimatum: full and immediate financial restitution to the trust in exchange for our silence on the criminal embezzlement. I did not want to spend the next 2 years of my life sitting in a courtroom watching my father play the victim for a jury. I wanted the money back in my grandmother's trust where it belonged, and I wanted to completely sever them from my life. I gave David the green light to drop the hammer. The demand letter was delivered to the cheap rental apartment my parents had just moved into. It gave my father exactly 48 hours to wire $150,000 directly into the trust account. If the fund did not clear by Friday afternoon, David would personally drive the evidence of his wire fraud and perjury to the federal prosecutor's office. My father tried to fight it. He called David in a complete panic, begging for a payment plan. He pleaded for mercy, claiming he was a retired man with no steady income. David was an absolute shark. He calmly reminded Thomas that federal judges do not care about your retirement plans when you steal money and commit perjury. David told him to find the money, or find a good criminal defense attorney, because he was going to need one. To avoid spending his twilight years wearing a federal prison jumpsuit, my father was forced to do the one thing that completely broke his spirit. He had to completely liquidate his entire retirement portfolio. As an accountant, I knew exactly what that kind of desperate financial move actually meant. When you drain a traditional retirement account before the age of 59 and a half, or in a massive lump sum, the financial penalties are absolutely catastrophic. My father had to cash out every single penny of his mutual funds, his 401k, and his individual retirement accounts, just to scrape together the principal amount he had stolen. But he did not just lose the $150,000 he owed me. He was hit with massive early withdrawal penalties. He bumped himself into the highest possible tax bracket, triggering an enormous federal and state income tax bill that would completely wipe out whatever small fraction of money he had left over. He traded his entire life savings for his freedom. By the time the wire transfer cleared into my grandmother's trust account, Thomas and Susan Hayes were entirely bankrupt. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life judging other people for their clothes and their cars, now found herself staring down her senior years with absolutely nothing. No historic estate, no country club memberships, no retirement safety net. They were left living paycheck to meager paycheck in a tiny, dingy apartment with thin walls and cracked linoleum floors. Their insatiable greed had cost them every single thing they valued in this world. And the absolute poetic justice was that their sacrifice did not even save their favorite daughter. Chloe and Trent had abandoned my parents to save themselves, but you cannot outrun the Internal Revenue Service. Because Trent had accepted stolen funds into his fake tech company, he triggered an automatic red flag in the federal banking system. When I anonymously submitted his fraudulent tax returns to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS, they descended on him with ruthless precision. A federal tax audit is not just a polite review of your receipts. It is a brutal, invasive dissection of your entire life. The IRS froze Trent's bank accounts. They seized his remaining business assets. They placed a massive federal tax lien on the luxury home he and Chloe could no longer afford to pay the mortgage on. Chloe called my mother completely hysterical, sobbing that federal agents were interviewing her friends and digging through her personal bank records. The wealthy, flawless image she had projected to the world was publicly shattered. She was losing her house, her cars, and her reputation. The perfect family that had thrown me out like garbage to protect their secrets had violently turned on each other, and they were all sinking together. I sat in the beautiful, quiet living room of my grandmother's house, looking out the large bay windows at the manicured lawn. The storm had finally passed. The house was mine. The trust was restored. I did not have to lift a finger to destroy them. I just had to stand my ground, hold my boundaries, and let their own lies catch up to them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be the victim they want you to be. When you stop shrinking yourself to make toxic people comfortable, their entire world collapses. If you are watching this and you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, I want you to know that your worth is not defined by the people who mistreat you. You have the power to walk away and build a beautiful life on your own terms. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to save yourself? Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one of your comments. Please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember to always protect your peace, because nobody else will do it for you. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next video. It has been exactly 1 year since the morning I stood on the curb and watched that cheap yellow rental truck disappear down the street, taking my parents and their toxic lies out of my life for good. Today, the historic estate my grandmother left me feels completely different. It no longer holds the heavy, suffocating energy of my mother's desperate need for social approval or my father's arrogant demands. I spent the last 12 months carefully and lovingly restoring the property to its original glory. The rich mahogany floors have been polished until they shine like glass, reflecting the warm afternoon sunlight that pours through the massive bay windows. I hired specialists to clean the antique Persian rugs, and I brought my grandmother's beautiful oil paintings back to life, restoring the vibrant colors that had faded over the years. The house smells like fresh lemon oil, baked bread, and old paper. It smells like peace. It smells like a real home. My career has also transformed in ways I never thought possible. A few months after the legal dust settled, my managing partner called me into his office. He had seen my absolute composure under extreme pressure when my mother tried to ambush me in the firm lobby. He told me that anyone who could handle that kind of personal chaos with such cold professional precision was exactly the kind of person he wanted leading his most important accounts. I was promoted to senior tax manager. I now have my own corner office with a beautiful view of downtown Columbus. I have a team of junior associates working under me, and a salary that guarantees I will never have to worry about my financial security again. I am respected for my intelligence and my hard work, not judged for my lack of a wealthy husband or my refusal to wear expensive designer labels. Through the inevitable gossip of the suburban grapevine, I occasionally hear updates about the people who used to be my family. The brutal reality of their situation is a stark contrast to the life they tried to steal from me. After liquidating his entire retirement portfolio to repay the trust and avoid federal prison, my father was left with absolutely nothing. Thomas and Susan Hayes, the couple who used to host lavish country club galas and look down their noses at anyone driving a car older than 3 years, are now renting a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the worst side of town. The building has peeling paint-thin walls and a broken security gate. To make ends meet, they were forced to take minimum-wage retail jobs. My father, the man who used to wear custom-tailored suits and bark orders at bank tellers, now wears a polyester vest and bags groceries at a discount supermarket. My mother, who once spent thousands of dollars a month on skincare and hair appointments, works the customer service desk at a local hardware store. I heard she spends her days scanning returned items and listening to customers complain. The country club friends they sacrificed everything to impress completely dropped them the moment the scandal broke. They are invisible now. They are living the exact life they always treated as a terrifying nightmare. And the golden child they destroyed themselves to protect did not fare any better. The federal audit on Trent's fraudulent tech startup was absolutely brutal. The Internal Revenue Service seized every single asset they had left. The luxury sport utility vehicles were repossessed. The massive custom-built house went into foreclosure and was auctioned off by the bank. The stress of total financial ruin and looming legal consequences shattered their flawless marriage. Chloe and Trent turned on each other viciously. They finalized a very bitter, very public divorce 6 months ago. Trent is working an entry-level sales job trying to pay off his massive legal debts. Chloe, my perfect sister who always told me I was a failure, is currently living in a cramped studio apartment and working as a receptionist. The beautiful, wealthy illusion they built their entire identities around collapsed completely, leaving them with nothing but the bitter reality of their own terrible choices. The poetic justice of it all is absolute, and it is grounded entirely in the reality of their own actions. It is strange to think about how much energy they wasted, trying to maintain a facade that was always destined to crumble. They poured all their love and resources into a daughter who only valued them for their money, and a son-in-law who used them as a shield for his criminal activities. They threw away the one daughter who actually cared about doing the right thing. They had an $800,000 estate and a comfortable retirement, but it was never enough. Their greed blinded them to the incredible privileges they already possessed. Now they have to wake up every single morning, put on their cheap work uniforms, and face a world that no longer cares who they are. They lost the house. They lost their money, and they lost the only person who might have actually helped them if they had just been honest. I do not feel pity when I hear these updates. I just feel a deep, profound sense of closure. When I sit in my grandmother's quiet living room, drinking my coffee and watching the morning light move across the walls, I spend a lot of time reflecting on the psychological reality of what it means to be the family scapegoat. For 26 years, I believed there was something fundamentally wrong with me. I thought I was too quiet, too boring, too practical. I believed my parents treated me like a burden because I was simply not worthy of the adoration they showered onto my sister. But the truth is much darker and much more common than people realize. In a toxic family system, the roles are assigned very early, and they have absolutely nothing to do with your actual character. A toxic family requires a golden child to project their desperate need for perfection onto the world, but they also require a scapegoat to carry all of their failures, all of their insecurities, and all of their emotional garbage. I was chosen to be the scapegoat because I was reliable. I was responsible. I was the one who could be trusted to fix things silently while they celebrated Chloe's loud, empty achievements. I was expected to swallow my hurt, suppress my needs, and sacrifice my own future to keep their fragile illusion intact. They did not love me. They loved my utility. They loved what I could provide for them. We are conditioned by society to believe that family is everything. We are told that blood is thicker than water, and that we must always forgive our parents because they gave us life. But blood does not excuse exploitation. Sharing DNA with someone does not give them a blank check to abuse you, steal from you, or treat you like an emotional punching bag. Conditional love is not actually love at all. It is a transaction. My parents' love was entirely conditional on my willingness to let them rob me blind. The moment I refused to pay the price of admission, the moment I stopped shrinking myself to fit into their tiny, comfortable box, their love immediately turned into vicious hatred. Setting ironclad boundaries with toxic family members is often framed as a cruel or selfish act. People who have never experienced this kind of emotional abuse will tell you that you are being too harsh or that you should try to be the bigger person. But setting boundaries is not cruelty. It is survival. It is the absolute bare minimum requirement for protecting your own mental and financial well-being. When I triggered Clause 7 and legally evicted my parents from my grandmother's house, I was not acting out of malice. I was acting out of self-preservation. I was simply enforcing a consequence that they had triggered themselves. They made the choice to break the law, and I made the choice to stop protecting them from the fallout. Many people assume that when you fight back against a toxic family, you are driven by a burning desire for revenge. But revenge is a toxic emotion that keeps you tied to the people who hurt you. I did not win this battle because I wanted to destroy my parents. I did not want them to suffer. I did not want them to bag groceries or live in a rundown apartment. I won because I finally realized that I valued the absolute truth more than I valued their toxic illusion. I valued my own peace more than I valued their conditional approval. They handed me the weapon of truth when they lied on those tax returns and committed perjury in that deposition room. All I did was refuse to lie for them anymore. The moment you stop participating in their lies, their entire system collapses. You realize that their power over you was only ever an illusion. They are just damaged, broken people trying to manipulate a world they cannot control. And once you see that you can never unsee it, you stop asking why they do not love you, and you start realizing that you do not need their love to build a beautiful, successful life. You step out of the scapegoat role, and you finally become the author of your own story. I know that there are so many people watching this who understand exactly what it feels like to live in the shadow of a golden child. If you have ever been the invisible one in your family, the one who was always asked to sacrifice everything to keep the peace, the one who was expected to carry the heavy burdens while everyone else took the credit, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You owe them absolutely nothing. You do not owe them your money, your time, or your mental health. You have the absolute right to protect your peace and your future. It is not selfish to walk away from people who only see you as a resource to be drained. It is not a betrayal to lock the door when the people outside are trying to burn your house down. You are worthy of genuine love and respect simply because you exist, not because of what you can do for them. The hardest step is simply realizing that you have the power to walk away. But once you take that step, the entire world opens up for you. There is a profound beauty in building a life that belongs entirely to you. You get to choose your family, you get to choose your friends, and you get to choose exactly who gets access to your energy. Do not let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting the beautiful life you have built. You survived the hardest part, and now you get to enjoy the peace that comes after the storm. If this story gave you strength, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Before you go, drop a comment below. Let me know what state or city you are watching from, and what time it is there. I read every single one. Stay strong, protect your boundaries, and I will see you in the next story.